So after 30 years of basically having my palette set up about the same way, I'm going to change things around. So with this wood, these little magnets and these screws right here, I'm going to show you how I make a palette knife holder that's going to be nice and sturdy here on the end of my palette rather than up here at the front. If you're interested, I'll show you how I do that. I'm going to make a palette knife holder and put it over here to the side of my palette rather than having my palette knives and my palette scraper back here on the back. The reason I'm doing that is because with teaching now, I don't paint every day like I did for the first 25 years. So I need to make sure that my paints don't dry out quite so quickly. So I'm going to put a plastic wrap holder on this side of my palette over here and have it so that I use one of these little guys right back here so that I can slide it out, slice it, and have it just sit there. And keep my paints wet, hopefully, a little bit longer than they have been lately. So, using these two pieces of wood, these two little magnets, you notice they have a little hole in them so I can screw them down, the screws that came with the package, and a little bit of E6000 glue, or whatever glue you have handy for wood. So these little magnets right here cost me about $2 a piece. I'm going to put one on each end of the wood so that it holds it onto my enamel table. Because my table's metal, it's very handy. And then these smaller magnets right here cost me about $1.25 a piece. And I'm going to put as many on this piece of wood as I need for all of my palette knives. And the nice thing is that the screws go right through that hole right there and they are flush. This is nice and flat. And my palette knives, they hold on really well. These small magnets have about 60 pounds of pull. These larger magnets have about 90 pounds of pull. So this is not going to come off of my table down here once I have the two attached to it. So I love that idea. I don't want my palette knives flying off. At the same time, I don't want them to be so difficult to pull that I can't get them off. So I have the smaller magnets for the palette knives. They'll come off nice and easy, but when I go to put them back, boom, they just stick there so quickly, and I don't have to worry about adjusting them or having them roll around or fall off my table. I can just stick them over there and boom, they're out of my way, and I can easily access them anytime that I want to. I kind of wish they made these brush ferrules metal like that as well, at least magnetized metal, so that I could do the same thing with them. But they're not, so I can't. As far as the idea for the plastic wrap, I'm going to do a video about that later once I actually make it. And here are some of the tools that I used to create this magnetic palette knife and scraper holder. Now you'll notice that drill bit right there says 1 3/8 on it inches. That is not correct. I found you'll see here in a bit that that's the wrong size. 1 1/4 actually worked. Now the magnet itself is actually just a hair, like a 32nd of an inch bigger than the 1 1/4. That's why I went bigger. But when I did the 1 1/4 inch hole, it fit beautifully in there. So 1 1/4 is the right bit to get for that. Clamps, all these other things, some of them are necessities. You can find your own, whatever works well for you. E6000 glue, it works well on the metal and on the wood, but there are other glues out there as well that you can use. Just find one that's good for metal and wood overall. The metal part isn't critical because the screws will hold it in place, but I like having the glue as an extra strengthening for it to hold it in place really well, because I want this to last for years. And then these are just a lot of extra tools that really came in handy. Dust mask, you're probably all well too familiar with those right now. Permanent markers, actually that was just to mark the drill bit. And that drill bit that you saw originally, I do change that. And I'll show you, I'll do some updates on tools here throughout the video, so you can see some of the things that I discovered, the mistakes that I made, and the things that I discovered that worked better than some of the tools that I originally began with. But each of these, there's just a square in there, a ruler to make straight lines, obviously. Some of these things are pretty obvious. Sandpaper, a sanding block, paper towels for the glue to clean up any overspills, that sort of thing. The file that's there to go with the sandpaper, some of that stuff's just handy to have. A lot of that's not absolutely necessary. You can use a table saw instead of the little saw, things like that. Just modify according to your own needs. but those are the tools that I started with. And I'll talk about many of those tools more in depth during the video as well. So the wood here is 1.5 inch wide by the oak is a 1/2 inch thick. The poplar is a 1/4 inch thick. Whatever wood is available to you, there's nothing critical about any of this. I'm just making it up as I go along. I'm just making basic lines so I can cut the wood into a 22 inch section. Actually both pieces, but I'll tie the two pieces together. I'm putting lines on the sides as well, just so I can see the lines well and I don't get lost. Because I'm going to be using a handsaw and I want to have a clear line to keep me straight. That's all. And then I clamp the wood together so I can cut those two pieces of wood at the same time. I just want it to be nice and tight so they don't move around on me. I want to make sure my cut is straight and true. A big anvil vice grip thing is not a necessity, but it was really handy at the time. And I put that cloth around the wood so that the teeth on the vice grip won't bite into the wood. I don't want it to damage the wood, so I just put a cloth around it. It'll still hold it nice and tight, but it won't damage the wood itself. And then any really fine-toothed saw blade so that I don't have a lot of big splinters or chunks out of the wood right here. I want a nice, fairly clean cut on the wood. This little saw right here, I think is generally designed for like PVC pipe to cut through. Has really fine little teeth on it, but it works great for wood. At least that's what I usually use it for. I did get it for my PVC when I was making my paint holders, paintbrush holders, but for wood, it works fantastic, especially for really fine cuts. And I do have a table saw that can do the same thing, but I didn't want to have to take my table saw out for one little tiny project like this. I usually do that just when I'm doing my wood panels or something like that. But this thing worked out great for just that one quick cut that I had to do in the wood. And then I turned the vise so that I could see the lines really well. There are probably a lot easier ways to do this, but since I don't do this very often, I'm just improvising all the way along. You'll probably figure out ones that are much better than me. And if you do, please let us know about that down in the comments. What tools, what methods work out really well for you? Because that would be handy for everyone to know about. So I clamped down the wood because now I'm just going to quickly sand the edges of that wood. Not because I'm not doing it for the aesthetics. I'm doing it just so that in the future it doesn't splinter. I've noticed that if I keep the wood a little bit rounded on the edges, then it doesn't tend to splinter as much. So I'm not trying to get a nice smooth finish or anything like that. I don't care about the aesthetics of it because it's going to get beat up. It's my palette knife holder. I mean, I want things to look beautiful, but there's nothing critical about this. This is just a project to make life easier when I'm painting. So I use I know that's generally more like a metal file right there, but it's working out great on the wood. It gets the bulk of it off of there quickly, and then I use a little bit finer sandpaper just to come in and round it and smooth it out a little bit. So that's 150 grit sandpaper that I'm using, and I'm not even worried about the exact finish or anything. I'm just getting rid of any tendency that the wood might have to splinter in the future, because I don't want to go grabbing something off of there and have a big splinter of wood stick into my finger. And that's it. That's all I'm concerned about here. So if you're not worried about that at all, then don't even sand it. It's not really necessary. The other thing about rounding off the edges is I find it tends to have less tendency to beat up the wood in the future too. It just saves it a little bit. There's not much of a rounding, it's just a little bit. And then I'm getting ready to do some gluing and things like that, so I'm just getting rid of all of that sawdust. There's not a whole lot of it. I wasn't sanding vigorously, but I wanted to get rid of everything that I could there. I didn't want to have sawdust around when I start gluing. Now keep in mind with this project that I am not trying to be exact with anything. I want to get it done quick so I can get back to the easel and start painting. So I'm not worried about getting right in there and making sure everything is just lined up perfect. So if you're looking for that, this isn't it. But as long as it works, that's what I'm concerned about. So I'm really hopeful that this is going to work. I put a line on the end of the tooth. This is something we used to do when I was doing my MFA. Printmaking was my minor, and we would put little lines like that to line up plates and papers and other things. So I just took a cue from my printmaking days and put some lines on the end there so that I would know those two lined up with each other when I went to put them back together, especially since I had sanded the edges. Now I'm measuring out where that magnet is going to go, and you notice I do not have a lot of room to work with. The magnet is 1 1/4 and the piece of wood is 1.5 inches wide, so I have just a little bit on each side, and it's going to be a bit precarious trying to put a hole there and still have some sliver of wood on the edges to hold it all together. But I'm going to attempt it. Now I will warn you, this doesn't work for me, and you will see that here shortly. I didn't want it right at the very edge. I wanted to leave a little bit of space in there. I really didn't think it through as far as where I was going to put the small magnets and the space for screws and all that from both sides coming together. So there were some things I should have thought through a little bit more carefully, and it would have saved me some time. But you're going to learn from my mistakes, so it at least saves you some time. So I used the hole in the middle of the magnet to line everything up so I know exactly where to put the point of the drill bit. And now I'm getting ready to make the hole where I want to inset that magnet. Still have wood around the edges of it, but basically have it nicely recessed into the wood and come up and butt up against the other piece of wood that I have. And I try to be careful with it. My bit and the magnet, when I lined them up, looked like they were basically the same size as each other, but I found out the hard way that they weren't. Okay, so in hindsight, maybe I should have measured it a little bit more. With that first drill bit, I knew I had a sliver of wood that was going to be left, and I was hoping, but obviously it didn't work. So it's a good thing I had an extra piece of wood. Now the smart thing would have been to use that extra piece of wood as the test subject, but I didn't. Fortunately, cutting and sanding that extra piece of wood took maybe 3 minutes, but it would have been nice had I figured that out in the first place. The nice thing is you can learn from my mistakes. So I experimented with that broken piece of wood and tried a smaller drill bit, and it worked. I could actually go a little bit smaller than I was going. The 1 1/4 worked out a lot better than the 1 3/8. So 1 3/8. This is not 1 3/8. This is what I used for the small holes. This is 1 inch for the small holes with those magnets. The other is 1 1/4 for the bigger magnets. When I had originally measured it out, the magnet was about a 32nd of an inch bigger than the 1 1/4, so I went with the bigger drill bit. But fortunately, the small bit worked out really well. It didn't break my piece of wood on the second go round. So it was very nice. I was still careful with that piece of wood because that would have been very sad if I broke another one, but it worked, and I was very happy that it worked. I also discovered something else. This bit right here is a whole lot better than this bit for getting those real clean circles with just a little bit of space around it. So if you're looking at the different bits, this bit right here is great for just getting in there and really digging that wood out quick for wood projects where we want to make a hole and we don't care about the front or the back and what it does to it. These are great. But if we want a nice clean hole, this is called a Forstner Bit, and these are fantastic. I wish I had had some experience with these before I started the project, because then I probably wouldn't have wasted that first piece of wood. So to be extra careful while using that original bit, I cut halfway through and then flip the piece of wood over and then cut halfway through again. That way I wouldn't come out on the bottom and have it catch and break that piece of wood. And it worked out beautifully. And then I just repeated the process on the second side, and both of them worked. Miracles do happen. So the holes looked good, and it was ready to go. It was now time to glue it, to glue the two pieces together, to get those first two magnets in there and screw them in so that they were solid. So on both pieces, I put a very thin layer of glue. It wasn't a lot, it was pretty thin, and then I clamped them together. I wanted to make sure, especially on those little tiny slivers of wood that I got some glue on there so that they would be stuck to the other plank of wood to make sure that they would hold together and that those little pieces of wood wouldn't someday in the future, get broken off of there. I don't know why they would, but just kind of precautionary, I guess. But then it's all glued up and ready to go. Now, a more ideal situation with the wood, rather than what I used, I had a 1.5 inch by 1/2 inch oak plank and a 1/4 inch by 1.5 inch poplar plank. And it worked out great. It's stuff I already had in my studio. It was stuff that I was using for cradling wood panels or my ABS plastic panels. I wasn't really going to use it for the panels, so I used it for this. So it was stuff that I already had around. But if I was just going out to get something for this, I would probably go with something that's like a 3/4 inch oak or something like that. I'm not a woodworker, so I don't know the best wood to use. That was stuff I already had on hand. But rather than dealing with 2 pieces of wood, just getting 1 piece of wood that's like 3/4 of an inch or an inch thick would really be helpful, because then there'd be plenty of space for those screws and not having to worry about them coming through the back side. And a 2-inch plank instead of an 1.5 inch would be ideal as well, because then there'd be plenty of space. Although for the small magnets, this worked out really well. And it doesn't take up as much space on my palette. So, there's give and take in all of these things. But this worked out well for me. Materials I already had here on hand. But if you're going to get materials to do this, you might want to think about doing it a little bit differently. So I put my first 2 clamps on there, got them nice and tight, made sure the 2 pieces of wood all the edges were lined up correctly. And then I realized there was a little bit of, looked like bowing in the middle. So I went and grabbed another clamp to get that middle clamp down well. And then it was solid. Since these are not self-drilling screws, and because that oak is really tough wood, I wanted to make sure I pre-drilled for those screws so that they wouldn't split the wood or have too much trouble digging down into it. So I set the tape on that drill bit to make sure that I could see the depth that I was going to, so that I didn't go too deep and go right through the other side. Then I screwed those down till the magnets were solid, that they didn't move around, didn't spin, and everything was tight. Then I just had to let it sit overnight so that that glue would set up very strongly, so I could get right into it the next day with those little magnets and get them put in. I wanted to make sure that they were nicely stuck and grounded and weren't going to come apart on me. I wanted to give the glue plenty of time to set up, because I wanted to make sure that when I screwed those smaller magnets in, the screws didn't push one board away from the other and separate the two. So leaving it overnight gave plenty of time for that glue to be nice and solid. So I let it sit overnight so that the glue could set up nicely, and everything is tight. I just set it down on my metal pallet and it stuck like a charm. This thing, it was really on there. It's not going anywhere. So now I just have the little magnets to put on this side of it. So got the 2 magnets on this side. They fit in there beautifully. Everything is almost flush. Not quite, but almost. I did the oak here because I wanted the screws to have something nice and hard to bite into, so that they won't ever pull out of there. So I've got these little magnets now. I'll be putting it right up on here. I won't be putting them on the very end here, because I have over on my palette, I've got my Terpenoid Naturals in a container over here on the very end that's going to take up about this much space on there. The rest of it, I'll be putting magnets, as many as I can get on there. So I'll measure that out and find out. Now these magnets, they don't have to be inset like this. But I wanted to do that because I wanted everything to be flush, especially this part where it's attaching to the palette, because I didn't want paint and any solvent, if solvent goes that direction, I didn't want it going underneath. I want it coming up to the edge and stopping right there. It doesn't really matter, but that's just my own inclinations. Now as far as the little magnets, I could just have them set up on top like this, but I kind of like this idea of it being more flush. I don't know if I'm going to have it go all the way down in there, because I do like that the screw will have something to really attach into with this oak. But I think I am going to at least inset them a ways into there so that they don't just sit up on top like that. because I think it looks better. I shouldn't even worry about it because I should just get it done as quickly as possible so I can get back to painting. I think that's part of being an artist. we tend to take and spend too much time doing things that probably don't need the time put into them, but it looks better, and so I think I'm going to do that. So I started with measuring out 4 inches in because I was taking up that slack for where I'm going to have my Terpenoid Naturals container, and I really don't need magnets on that end, although I could probably put magnets there. I just decided to leave that area empty, but I did like having it go all the way across my palette right there because then it kind of becomes a buffer to keep my Terpenoid Naturals from sliding off the end of my table, which it's never done, but it has come close a time or two, especially when I'm jump roping in my studio right here. Then I measured the halfway point on each end and put a straight line across there so that I could do the crosshairs to line up the magnets where the screws would go, right in the middle of the board. So then I measured out every 1.25 inches on there because the magnets themselves are 1 inch wide, and I wanted to leave 1/8 of an inch in between each of the magnets. So measuring out was pretty quick. 1.25 inches, and then another 1.25 inches, another 1.25 inches, and so on. When I want to keep a drill bit from going too deep, I usually put tape so that it goes to the level that I want it to be. I'm going to do that to this, only I use this painter's tape on here and it doesn't stick nearly as well as electrical tape. And I want to make sure that these don't go too deep because then there will be nothing, my magnet will slip too far into the wood and there'll be nothing for my palette knife to hook onto. So I want to make sure that I get this actually right where I want it, the exact depth that I want it to be. So I'm going to put electrical tape right around the outside edge of this so I don't go past that. So I know exactly where to stop. I tried to get it lined up right in the center on those crosshairs, but I was struggling with it. So I did something different. Another thing that I didn't think about in the beginning was this. This is just an awl. It's a pointy screwdriver. Nothing there, not really a screwdriver, sorry, but just for making holes is all it is. And then a rubber mallet so I don't break this with a metal hammer. And that worked out brilliantly because this little point right here in the middle of this big bit is pretty tough to see. So when I just have the crosshairs that I made with a pencil and trying to line that up in there, it was kind of tough to get that right in the center of that. But making a hole with this, as long as I make a big enough hole, it worked out great. Now if I don't make a big enough hole, this little point wants to catch into all the grain on the wood, and it's even then still tough to get it into that hole. So make a big enough hole because it's going to disappear anyway. It's not going to make any difference, and this will just slide right in there, and it works out great. It was such a time saver. I lined up that awl with those crosshairs and then made those holes so that my drill bit, the point on it, could go right in there and I'd be lined up and ready to go to make each of those holes. And on the last hole, I realized that that space looked too long and I had gotten it about 1/4 of an inch off. So just remeasured that and then put a hole in there. And I came just past that 4-inch mark because I thought, well, I don't know, maybe an extra magnet there wouldn't hurt. So I put an extra space there. That was, of course, before I realized that I didn't have nearly as many magnets as I thought I did. So to inset these little magnets, I thought about using one of these, but it's got this long point on it right here, and I knew that I didn't have a lot of space for that screw to go down in, and I didn't want this taking away any of that meat because I want the screw to really hold these in well. So I looked up some bits on Lowe's and I found these. I thought, oh, that's perfect. Has this little tiny tip right there, point on it, and so it won't take up any space at all with my magnet or for the screws for my magnet. And this makes a perfect hole, a nice clean hole for this to fit down into. So I looked up and got the one that was just the right size for this magnet right here. And when I got there, they're like $12.50 a piece for one of these. But then I thought, you know what? Maybe if I get one for my bigger magnets, if I have some projects in the future where I want to use those, I'll be prepared. But that was $14 for the bigger one. And then I thought, I don't remember exactly what size it is, so I better get a couple of them that are kind of in the same size grouping. And that was another $15. And then I saw this kit right here, $50. And it has 14 bits in it for $50. When these are going to be like 10 bucks a piece, that'd be $140 at least. To 100 and, I don't know, to a lot. On the back here, it has all the bits I need and then some for future projects. I don't know if you're like me, but I can't pass up a deal like that. Maybe that comes from being an artist and buying in bulk. I can get a lot better deal than when I buy little tiny tubes of paint. So now using that Forstner bit and some tape on there, I start drilling the hole. But I quickly find that it's kind of not working very well. It's clogging up on me. That tape seems to be causing some problems. Another thing that I discovered is that putting tape on a regular drill bit works out pretty well. And even on something like this, it's possible because there's nothing here. The wood just goes out. The tape is straight on it and nothing gets in there. It works out just fine. But on a Forstner bit, it doesn't work out well at all because all the wood is being filtered through here and out these channels, and the tape just kind of clogs it all up and doesn't let the wood move on out of there. So you can see that tape did not work well as a measurement tool for how deep my bit was going. So what worked better for me was to put a line on here. Now, that's another thing in hindsight. Don't put the line on there when you've got it in the depth of the hole, because especially with a permanent marker, because it leaves a nice dirty line of ink on the wood, which should be obvious, but it wasn't at the time. I didn't even think about it. But once I put a line on here, I could see that line enough that I could measure my depth. Now I kept on going a little bit more and a little bit more just to get it exactly where I wanted it, but that was very helpful to make sure that I did not overstep how deep I went with that hole. So I set the drill bit into the hole, drew a line all around it, and got ink all over my wood. Then I tried to sandpaper that off real quick and realized I just made a bigger mess, so I left it. And then I just started drilling holes, and I went right on up the line. Periodically, I would stop and put a magnet in there just to see where I was at. Wanted to make sure that it wasn't off kilter at all. I wanted to make sure each one of them was fairly level with each other, and so I would adjust little bits at a time. But that line that I put on the drill bit worked out really well. I could see it easily compared to the rest of the metal, and that helped me to keep from going too deep with any of those holes. The one thing that I was certain of was that I did not want to go too deep because then my magnet would be so low under the wood that if I set a palette knife on there, it was not going to stick to it. So that wouldn't have worked out well at all. Now you might be wondering, why didn't I just put the magnets straight onto my palette and not worry about the wood? Well, they're not really magnetized very strongly on this side, so they move all around. They don't stick. It's just the one side that is really the powerful magnet. So it didn't work out. They might have other magnets that would do that, but I liked the idea of having them all on a panel like that where I can remove it if I want to and get it out of the way, or I can move it to a different section. I have more leeway with it. I can play with it more. So I like that idea. And I like the idea that I can screw them down so that I have that extra enforcement there, so that when I pull my palette knife off or my palette scraper, the magnet's not going to come with it. I love that. So I repurposed an old bristle brush to help clean out any larger pieces of sawdust. Then I sanded and filed down any straight edges because I really wanted them to be more rounded. Just again, trying to get rid of any possibility of splinters or anything like that, or edges that might break in the future. Then I vacuumed up all the sawdust so that I wouldn't have any little pieces getting in there and making my magnets not level. I didn't want anything getting into that glue and causing things to shift or get out of balance in there. And then I did an assembly line fashion, putting glue into each of the spaces so that the magnets were ready to go. Another thing that I discovered, I bought 3 boxes of magnets. I thought I had gotten 2 boxes of the smaller magnets, but I didn't. There are 12 small magnets that come in a box. Boxes look like this, and each one of them has their own box of screws that comes with it as well. The bigger magnets come like this, and there are 8 of them in a box. I thought I had gotten 2 boxes of smaller magnets and 1 box of the bigger magnets. I did it the other way around. I guess I liked the idea of the strong magnets. Unfortunately, when I went to do my project, I didn't have nearly as many small magnets as I thought. And I really don't want to put these stronger magnets on there for anything because they are really strong. I mean, if I try to pull my palette knife off, I'm going to have to fight it to get off of there, or even my palette scraper. Anything that I put on there, I'm going to have to fight pretty hard to get it off of there. Now, to use these for something like my Terpenoid Naturals container that is magnetic, that might work out all right. But that's a different project. So what I didn't realize here was that when I try to screw this in, the screw goes to the big magnets. And I didn't know at this time that they were different sizes. So this screw just keeps on turning and turning, and I thought that it just wasn't going into the wood. So I decided, all right, I need to drill out the holes more and make sure that the screws are all going to go into the wood easily and not split something or break anything. Eventually I realized that screw just doesn't fit, but it took me a while. So I went assembly line again, drilled out a hole for each of those screws, and then I had to clean up all that sawdust to again avoid the possibility that things might be uneven, that some of the magnets, the sawdust might get them off kilter or something. You know, it's really handy to have experience with these things. I found out that I don't. And that lack of experience definitely caught up to me during this part of the process. So the last observation was that when I measured everything out for these small magnets, I was cognizant of the one on the back here, especially that screw right there, and I offset enough so that the screw would end up right in between them. Hopefully, at least that's what I tried to do. Now, this screw did touch a little bit on this screw, which wasn't great, but it didn't really affect it. Well, at least when I would put the drill into there, it touched it a little bit, but it worked out great. The problem was that when I screwed the screw all the way through, it hit the very end of this and pushed that out of there. And that's when I got that crack right there because it was pushing the screw and everything out. I screwed it in so quickly, I didn't even pay attention until I heard the pop of it cracking. So I glued that crack, clamped it tight, and it's all working out great. But these screws were just barely, some of them came through, some of them did not. I probably should have gone with 2 half-inch pieces of wood instead of 1 half-inch piece, but this will work out just fine because I have a little bit of these magnets. They're sticking out just a hair, and it's enough to compensate for these. So there isn't going to be any warbling or anything when it's on my palette. But at the same time, I had to cut that screw with some bolt cutters. I cut the tip of it off so that it wouldn't come down and hit on that magnet. And then it worked out just fine. Worked out beautifully. But that was something that I didn't expect as well. So watch for that. Fortunately, this screw was over enough that it did not hit the magnet at all. So I got lucky on that one. So once I discovered that there were different size screws, I finally found the bag that had the last 10 of the skinnier screws, and I used each of those. But I skipped that second magnet and the one at the end. Now, if you notice, all these magnets were already in here when I came back. That's because I had a lunchtime Zoom room hangout with our members, and I thought I was planning everything so I would be done in time, but with all those unexpected obstacles, I wasn't. So right when the Zoom room started, the members and I are just hanging out, getting to know one another, and we're eating lunch, we're talking studio shop and that sort of thing. And since I had already put all the glue in there, I thought I'd better get those magnets in there so that that glue didn't start setting up during the hour lunchtime hangout. So I brought it over, and while we talked, I just put those magnets in there. That's why you didn't see me doing that during the video. So if you notice, I'm putting glue on the end of each of those screws, and that's because I want that glue to go down in and seal the screw and the glue all together, just to give it some extra oomph in there. And I cleaned up all of the excess glue, anything that was there, made the magnets very shiny. I didn't want to have any glue on there or anything else that might in the future impede the magnetic quality of those pieces of metal. So they're all shiny and looking like new. And then of course I had to discover where the 2 missing screws were. And the other thing about each box coming with its own bag of screws, the screws are not magnetic, which I found out is really helpful because I came up 2 screws short for the smaller magnets. I realized after a short time that I had used those on the big magnets. The first 2 that I did, I used them on those because I didn't know that they were different sizes. They all look the same, but for the big magnets, do a video like this and you find out how difficult a word like magnet can be to pronounce. The screws are just a little bit wider and they will not fit through the hole in the small magnets. They're the same length, but not the same width. But they look very close to each other, very, very close. So I went around thinking that I had just lost a couple of screws. I went around trying to find screws that I could use. And I got some like this, but they had the pan head, that's the rounded head on it. And I thought because they were smaller, that maybe they would fit down into that groove that's in those magnets. I thought it would fit down in there and still work out all right. It doesn't. It's still set above the plate of the magnet, and I wanted that to be perfectly flat. So I took those back out. But in using a different screw, one that is magnetic or one that's attracted to magnets, it became really problematic trying to get that into the hole because it kept wanting to stick to the magnet and go to the side. So I can see why they sent us screws that aren't attracted to magnets. I also discovered that when I get a package in like that, I better not mix and match because they don't necessarily mix and match. And that can cause problems. So now I figured out what was going on. I found the 2 missing screws, took them out. Fortunately, I hadn't really put much glue on those big magnets, just what I had on the wood, which was very thin. So I popped both the magnets out of their spots, put more glue in there, replaced them, used bigger screws, and then turned to the small magnets again and finished those off. I also glued up the end of that where it had cracked and got everything in good order. Then I cleaned everything up well again, made sure there weren't any problems somewhere that I needed to take care of, and clamped it down and let it sit for the night so that once again it could dry and be ready for the next day. Now when it comes to putting my palette knives on here, this is going to work out so well because they just stick like a charm. All of them. Boom, 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 boom. Boom, boom. There we go. And voila. And then to pull them off, they just slide right off of there. Boom. So easily. And then I don't even have to think about it. They just go right into place. I love it. And I can move them wherever I want so they're out of the way. And I don't have to worry about them anymore. So I think that's going to be pretty convenient. And as far as attaching it to my palette, oh man, that is on there hard. It's not coming off unless I really work at it. And lifting my palette knives off, no problem. They come off so easy. So that part of it was a tremendous success. And as soon as I get another package of those smaller magnets in, I can fill in the last 3 holes and I'll be done. I love it. The last thing I'm going to do is I'm going to cover the whole thing with linseed oil or walnut oil to preserve the wood. Yes, we can paint oil paints directly onto wood because it will not rot wood. It'll rot canvas, like cotton and linen canvas, but it won't rot wood. In fact, oils are a great preservative for wood. That's what woodworkers use all the time. I'm not a woodworker, but that's what I've read. I'm going to put some linseed or walnut oil all over the wood to preserve it and keep it safe. But really, I don't have to worry about my oil paints as far as what it's going to do to the wood. This thing should last me the rest of my life, I think. I'm excited about that. And don't forget about the free art training page at masteroilpainting.com. We have tons of art training on there, and artists love it. And you definitely want to head over to the Artist Hangout Zoom room that we have on masteroilpainting.com as well. You can meet up with artists from all over the world and hang out in a Zoom room that's going 24 hours, 7 days a week. And our membership, where we do monthly critiques, we have the monthly hangouts, we have monthly Zoom room trainings. So just like the lunch hangout that I talked about in this video, there are all kinds of opportunities that come with being a member. And we have members who are just getting started, just picked up a paintbrush, all the way up to professionals who are selling their work in galleries. It is a community of artists who are just wonderful people who encourage and support each other and help one another thrive. So get over to masteroilpainting.com and find out all the things that are available to you. I hope it helps, and I hope you find it useful as well if you decide to try it out in your own studio. Have fun and happy painting!